I'm Amanda Leitner, and welcome to Rochester Rising, where we amplify the stories of Rochester entrepreneurs. Welcome to episode 171 of the podcast today. So today we got to chat with Dr. Tim Nelson, a researcher and physician at Mayo Clinic, and one of the founders of ReGen Theranostics, a local biotech business. Dr. Nelson is the director of the Todd and Kara Wainick Family Program for Hypoplastic Left Heart Syndrome, and he's also the Regional Director of Innovation at the Mayo Clinic Health System in Eau Claire. So on the podcast today, we talk with Dr. Nelson about how he first came to Rochester in 2005 for a residency at Mayo Clinic. We also talk about his journey with ReGen Theranostics and his development recently as a podcaster. So he also has a podcast about hypoplastic left heart syndrome, which is called Cause to Cure. So today on the program, we cover a lot of ground with Dr. Nelson talking about hypoplastic left heart syndrome. So for those of you not familiar with this disease, it's a severe congenital heart disease where infants are born without the left side of their heart, and they have to undergo 3 open heart surgeries to survive this syndrome. We talk a lot about the podcast today as well about ReGen Theranostics, a local biotech company that started in 2010 to create and supply labs with reproducible induced pluripotent stem cells. ReGen Theranostics was the first tenant on the 3rd floor of the Minnesota BioBusiness Center, and they have since moved out to a building on 41st Street here in Rochester. So before we launch into the podcast today, just wanted to do a little bit of science talk about what induced pluripotent stem cells are and what stem cells are in general for those of us not as familiar with this concept. And all of this information is directly from the NIH pages. So what are stem cells? So stem cells are cells that can differentiate or become cell types in the body during early development and growth stages. Under certain conditions, they can be induced or programmed to become tissue or organ-specific cells with very specific functions, especially related to repair and disease treatment. However, there's still work to be done and research to be performed to understand how stem cells can be used for cell-based therapies, which are more commonly known as the field of regenerative medicine. So generally, we think of stem cells can be classified into embryonic stem cells and adult stem cells. So embryonic stem cells are derived from embryos, as the name suggests, whereas adult stem cells are undifferentiated cells, so they haven't committed to a specific cell type yet, but they're found amongst differentiated cells or more committed cells in organs or tissues throughout the adult body. The adult stem cells have the ability to renew themselves, and they can differentiate to become the main cell type in their cell or tissue or organ that they are found in. And their main role is in tissue repair. Compared to these adult stem cells, embryonic stem cells are pluripotent, which means they can become all types of cells in the body, so they have a little bit more capabilities. Whereas adult stem cells are thought to be more limited to differentiate or become cell types similar to that found in their tissue or organ of origin. So more limited differentiation capability. So what ReGen does is they create reproducible induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPSCs. So these are adult stem cells that have been reprogrammed to an embryonic stem cell-like state. And this is done by forcing the cells to express genes and other factors that define the cell as more embryonic stem cell-like cells. And why do you want to do this? So again, embryonic stem cells have the capacity to become more cell types than adult stem cells. And these induced pluripotent stem cells are useful tools for drug development and disease modeling, again, with hopes to be used for regenerative medicine. So just a little science nugget for you just to get us all on the same page before we launch into the podcast today. A reminder that our podcast can be found on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. You can find them on our website and also on our YouTube channel. And definitely check out our website as well for other stories about innovation and entrepreneurship here in Rochester. So I was able to chat with Dr. Nelson at the ReGen Theranostics site early in March. So you're in for a real treat today with the podcasts. All right, so now on to the show today with Dr. Tim Nelson. Well, thanks for doing this today. I usually like to start by asking everybody how they originally got to Rochester.
Yeah, good question. So my Rochester connection was out of medical school. I graduated and had to pick a residency, and so I picked Mayo Clinic, Rochester, Minnesota, as my internal medicine cardiology fellowship as a combined program called this Clinical Investigators Training Program. And so I came here from Milwaukee, Wisconsin originally, and I guess it was 2005 when I came.
So it's been a while.
Yeah, time flies when you're having fun, I guess.
Yeah, it'll be 13 years for me this July. So it goes fast. It's supposed to be 3 months, been 13 years. So that's how it goes. So you're a physician at Mayo Clinic, an MD, PhD, focused on hypoplastic left heart syndrome. So for people not familiar, what is HLHS? Because I do think we have a lot of people interested in science, a lot of biotech entrepreneurs listening, so I'm sure some people know, but for others.
Well, hypoplastic left heart is one of the most, if not the most severe form of congenital heart disease. Infants are born without the left side of their heart. So the easiest way to think of it is if you have a 100 horsepower motor on the fishing boat and a 5 horsepower trolling motor on the fishing boat. The 100 horsepower is kind of like the left side that pumps blood around your body, and the 5 horsepower trolling motor is the motor that pumps blood just to the lungs and back. And these kids are born without the 100 horsepower motor. And so what requires is 3 open heart surgeries at 3 days, 3 months, or 3 years. 3 days, 3 months, 3 years, we like to say. And these 3 open heart surgeries allow the 5 horsepower engine to actually function like the 100 horsepower engine. But now imagine running the fishing boat around the lake with a 5 horsepower motor its entire time. It puts a lot of stress on it. So this is a very severe form of congenital heart disease. There's no cure for it. It requires open heart surgeries to allow kids to survive. And the statistics are about 60% will live without a transplant till their 5th birthday. So that's a pretty bad number.
Yeah.
However, some of us, if we were born before 1980, wouldn't actually be here today because the surgeries were only invented in the 80s. So it's been remarkable progress for this rare congenital heart disease, but it's also very inadequate progress if you're one of the families that are affected by this. So that's really what has inspired us to take a dedicated, focused approach on a rare congenital heart disease.
Mm-hmm. So how did you personally get interested in working with this condition?
Yeah, I was a medical student doing my PhD in Milwaukee. Milwaukee was known at the time to be in a place to go for these surgeries. And I was aspiring to be a cardiothoracic surgeon when I was in medical school. And I spent a lot of my time when I wasn't in the lab doing my research and my PhD over in the pediatric OR with Dr. Jackwis and Dr. Tweddle, who were both in Milwaukee at the time. And I fell in love with the surgeries. I fell in love with the complexities. I fell in love with everything about it. But then it was also this realization when you would go to clinic in the afternoon and see a 4-year-old that had been through all of the surgeries, had been through things none of us can really fully imagine, and then they develop heart failure, and there's nothing we can do for this 4-year-old other than do a transplant. And so there's this dichotomy for me that was like this euphoria and the celebration a half an hour earlier in the OR that we're doing these amazing surgeries and saving these lives, with only the harsh reality that a significant percentage of them didn't have a good sustainable solution, and we had nothing to offer them. And that really led me down the we got to do better type of pathway. And as a young medical student, you think anything is possible, and we thought, why not do something better? And so that's where we started getting more involved in research. And I've been forever committed to this area because of those experiences I had as a medical student. Yeah,
absolutely. So we're in the lab/office space at ReGen Theranostics out on 41st Street. So I think before diving into what you do here, what kind of need or gap was there in the scientific biomedical community for a biotech like this?
Yeah, so at the biotech that we'll talk more about today really came out of a regenerative medicine, cell-based perspective. And early on, when Shinya Yamanaka won the Nobel Prize in 2012 for the bioengineered iPS cells, or induced pluripotent stem cells, with Ike as a faculty here at molecular medicine, we started working together almost immediately to reprogram cells, starting in animal models and then doing human patient cells. We started doing this technology as soon as it became publishable, as soon as I became aware of it. And with that gap, there became a full-time job of just making cells for researchers and for our lab and for other people. And it really inspired us to think we got to build some sort of a core service, if you will, that could be available on demand 7 days a week and scalable to support this cell-based engineering effort that was really at its infancy in 2012.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think having stable cell lines that you know what their origins are, it takes so much time and research.
Yeah, it does.
I used to work with osteoclasts, and you had to isolate them every time. You had to come in to the lab every other day, no matter what, holidays, weekends, whatever. Otherwise, they wouldn't differentiate, or they wouldn't get to the end point.
Sure.
They'd just be weird, kind of undifferentiated cells. So it's a huge need to have a reliable source of cells to further your research. So yeah, so do you want to talk a little bit about more about what you do here at ReGen in terms of the products and services that you offer?
So when we started in 2000 and early on, I guess we started the company in about 2010. The Nobel Prize was awarded in 2012. So in that early time period, in 2010 when we started, it was really figuring out how to make the induced pluripotent stem cells reproducible. Everybody was trying it. Everybody had some success. You could get it to happen once in a while, but it was very chaotic. So what we did is we committed to a team that wasn't postdocs or students that weren't going to get a career out of figuring this out, but really a core group of us that were committed to the quality control, as you mentioned, with cells. And so we really committed ourselves just to the quality control of iPS reprogramming. And we had some amazing people working with us from the very beginning that really helped us figure this out. And then incrementally, step by step, we've scaled it to having arguably one of the largest experiences in the country, if not the world, in producing induced pluripotent stem cells from our patients at Mayo Clinic. We've now done over 800 patients that we've reprogrammed into induced pluripotent stem cells for ourselves and for other groups. And it's a dedicated professional activity that's 7 days a week. In a farming community like ours, it's more like having the pigs and cattle on the farm rather than the soybeans. It's a daily commitment.
Right. And I think we're definitely a community, focused on medicine too. And I think a lot of people have ideas around medicine, around biotech. So can you talk a little bit about how does an idea how does a concept like this go from idea to going through all the processes, clinical trials, whatnot, to get to where you are now?
Yeah, so to extend the bioengineered iPS cells, I guess our commitment was quality was going to be the key thing for clinical trials in the future. We didn't really have a true clean vision of how bioengineered cells would be used at that early stage in 2010, but we knew the quality had to be impeccable. And so that was what we've really committed ourselves to, the reproducibility of it, the cost effectiveness of it, and the highest quality. And so that was really 8 years of really dedicated effort of just getting quality control perfected. And we now are quite confident that we would be surprised if there was a patient we could not reprogram into induced pluripotent cells and have cells that we could then differentiate into what we care about is the cardiomyocyte. So we've gotten confident with the reproducibility of it, and that doesn't happen in a 6-month cycle. That doesn't happen even in a couple of years. That was really a firm, long commitment that we had to make. Now, in the evolution of that, we now are at the point where we have had our pre-IND meeting with the FDA about 8-9 months ago at this point, where we talked through them with a plan of launching the first clinical trial using bioengineered cardiac tissue for congenital heart disease. And the FDA was very constructive, very helpful, and now we are in the final stages of our preclinical testing with the processes that are getting locked down as we speak. And we hope in 2021 that we will be in a position to offer the first clinical trial of bioengineered cardiac tissue in a clinical trial. And that seemed like a pretty crazy idea in 2010. And to think that we've done that in 10 years is really a testament of many things. The ecosystem of Mayo Clinic and Rochester has been a major part of that success story. But on the other hand, it's really not a success. It's really just a stepping stone. We really have so much more work to do that just getting to this point where we can see the clinical trial has been a major effort. But going past that clinical trial and really getting this to a product development is a whole nother skill set and a whole nother team, and it just continues to snowball and grow with expertise as you go through every step of the process.
Yeah, so lots of growing, room to grow.
For sure.
And bring experiences in. So yeah, I think that nicely leads to my next question is, you're an MD, PhD, did a lot of scientific medical training. How do you bring in the business and entrepreneurial expertise to ReGen? And like you said, when you're looking to go to the next step, how are you guys adding that talent base to what you're doing?
I guess the way I think about this is stress and response. Everything in life is a stress, and you have to be conscious and deliberate about your response. And we committed ourselves to a path. We committed ourselves to the stress of that path of getting clinical grade. And each step of the way, you have to be building the team. It's all about people at that point, getting the right people that can take you to the next step. And in my case, it was actually Matt Nelson, who, yes, Nelson is my brother. And Matt was an industrial engineer, worked at Corporate 500 as a business consultant, ran a small company in a prior life, and it was really because of his involvement that allowed us to build on some of the early research and science that we were doing to make this more an industrial grade process. And then it's stress and response. It's the pain points of the day that you attack, that you accept the challenge and you don't give up on. And it's not easy, right? It's not easy for entrepreneurs, and the day-to-day struggle is real. It's not making billions of dollars for anybody. It's not about the money. It's not about the fame and notoriety. It's about being committed to a path and being committed to growing a team that can actually make a massive impact is what drives us.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting when you were talking a little bit earlier about, a lot of the times we think of tech startups and like this accelerated process that takes 3 months. And when you're dealing with something medical, something that goes into patients, it is like 5 to 10 to 15 years. Right. And just, understanding that process, having investors understanding that process, it's just a different trajectory.
Yeah, no, it is. It's a risk and reward, and stress and response analogies are relevant in that. And the way we did it is that we created a fee-for-service model early on, that we were generating the bioengineered iPS cells as a fee. We didn't get paid at ReGen unless there was a product delivered with the reprogramming. And that allowed you to bootstrap it. It allowed you to be like a core facility, if you will, that was charging the cost. No investor made profits on it. There was no profiteering. There was no margins necessarily on it. It was building a product at cost just to give yourself enough cycles of learning to learn how to perfect it and do better. And that was the key for us, is finding a way to pay the bills as you bootstrapped it, as you learned. And that's been the key to the growth and to the facility and to the people that are with us today.
Yeah. It's like you said, the company's been around for about 10 years.
Right.
So what have you seen as some major milestones from where you started at to where you are now? And you've changed location since you started too. Yeah,
no, I think there's change every week around here. So from people to processes to technology, from a manufacturing perspective, as the manufacturing teams that I don't do it today, there's a team that does it. They'll tell you, you got to lock it down. You got to have a manufacturing quality control system that's not changing day to day because you want to. That's what researchers do in the lab, change because they want to, right? In the manufacturing world, you got to lock it down. You got to have a good reason to change it. And so it's really an interesting dichotomy, if you will, to have our research lab working side by side in the facility out here with the manufacturing team, because the research lab is changing minute by minute, trying to perfect and try to invent. And the manufacturing team is interested in the long-term reproducibility. And getting those teams of teams working together in one facility has been another key to our success of the accelerated ability to test things in a low-risk environment and then bring them into a manufacturing environment when you know they're ready.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting too, like talking about that quality of scale, because like I was saying, I could make osteoclasts for my experiments, but then what if you talk about doing 100 like making enough for 100 experiments? The same thing if you're cooking at home and then thinking, oh, I'm going to use the same recipe to open a restaurant. It's just a totally different process.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's we're now growing beating cardiomyocytes that originated from a skin biopsy at the scale of a billion cardiomyocytes. So if you think about that in terms of the bioreactor spinner cultures that we use, it's about the size of a pot of coffee that each patient ultimately is being grown in. And we can go show you downstairs when we're done here to have you look at that. But going from that, from a Petri plate with a few hundred cells beating is a completely different ball game, and the lessons learned is dramatically different. You got to have a team of people committed to that scale-up process. It's not sufficient for a research paper to be published to then think that that's just automatically going to scale. That's very naive, and I probably was one of those naive people at one point.
So how does what you're doing here at ReGen relate back to your research and time in treating patients with hypoplastic left heart?
Yeah. So in that 10-year span, given the time it takes for the quality control in the bioengineered cells, we also in parallel worked on mononuclear cells derived from cord blood, actually at the time of birth. And so in parallel, we created a team of people in a manufacturing process to be on call 7 days a week to be able to collect cord blood and process it for any HLHS baby anywhere in the country. And that has been a dominant focus attention in the last 5 years. We now are in phase 2 clinical trials. We've treated in total over 75 patients with cell-based therapies. Most of these are 3-month-old infants having open heart surgery. And the far majority, 90% of those products have been manufactured here in this facility with the cord blood as the starting material. So keep in mind that we have multiple products in flight, and so our cord blood product is really the lowest risk, cheapest product to get into the clinic, and we're in phase 2B studies. And that creates a team and a pipeline and a system to allow us to have other products such as the bioengineered product in flight. And it takes a pathfinder project of the cord blood, bone marrow to be able to build the team and the infrastructure so that the bioengineered cells will have a glide path once it's ready for showtime.
Mm-hmm. So are you still seeing patients now, or are you primarily at ReGen, and how do you kind of balance all of that?
Yeah, no, I split my time in the lab across my roles in Eau Claire, Wisconsin as Director of Research and Innovation, and then as Director of the HLHS program. I don't see patients right now. My quote-unquote clinical time is really dedicated to the clinical trials. So as sponsor on a multi-center clinical trial, we have 7 sites that are open today across the country. We just signed up our 10th consortium member, Toronto, this week.
Awesome.
And so my job is really managing the clinical trials that are going on across this consortium. And that has grown and morphed into a full-time job of sorts. It's quite amazing how much energy and time goes into operationalizing a multi-center clinical trial, especially with the complexity of the one that we are talking about today.
Yeah. And we were talking about in the beginning, you have your own podcast on episode 10.
Yeah, basically.
But yeah, so what's that been like to start the podcast, and what have been some lessons learned?
Yeah, I know we started a Cause to Cure podcast based on everything we've talked about, because we have a research team that focuses on the cause and then on the pathway to a cure. And so Cause to Cure felt like a fitting title to our podcast. And it's really meant to, on a day-to-day, week-by-week basis, highlight some of the activities that go on in a program like this. There's 60 people spread across the country, or the institution here at Mayo Clinic, that touch this program. And just communicating within the team is a challenge, much less communicating to our families across the country that participate in these research studies. We believe it's really important to engage families, to engage the patients. It's been said many times that you can't start a startup company or a new industry in healthcare without first engaging the patients. And I think that's very, very true in the hyper-connected world, the social media world. They're coming to us for information, and they want to know what we're doing. And so we've tried to give a behind-the-scenes type of view of what we do, why we do it, how we do it, to just build confidence of what we're doing and hopefully build engagement. The community of congenital heart disease is very fragmented. It's dominated by institutional reputations, and really that's not sufficient to transform the care of these kids. We really have to figure out how to bring institutions together to work together to innovate and drive things forward. And companies like ReGen or partners are core to that, but you can't do it without a full integration with institutions where patients go and where patients trust providers. And so it's really an ecosystem that we've had to cultivate from the ground up, and we've been doing it for 10 years. It's been remarkable to see the consortium growth, but we still have a long ways to go to convince the engagement of practitioners, engagement of families, that we have to go beyond standard of care. If you want to do something better, you got to do something different. And that's hard for people to accept, to do something different sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. So where can people find your podcast?
Yeah, so it's Cause to Cure, so Cause, C-A-U-S-E, number 2, and then Cure, C-U-R-E. It's on all podcast major, so if you search it, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. But we'd love to have you jump onto it and check it out. But it's a very focused product development, congenital heart disease, so anybody in the congenital heart world might find it particularly interesting.
I have some final questions for you
Sure.
while we wrap up. Where is your favorite spot to be at in Rochester?
Probably my home. I tend to travel a lot and be around, and I enjoy being at home. I've got a beautiful wife and a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old sons that are a fun age to be around, and we look forward to the springtime coming so we can do some more things.
Yeah. What are you reading or listening to right now?
You know, I'm rereading a couple of books right now. I've heard people say that you're kind of a product of the 5 people you spend the most time together. Have you heard people say that? Yeah. It's got a lot of truth to it, don't you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
Everyone's impressionable.
Yeah. And I also think that there's a couple of books that probably, rattle around in your head. So I would say there's 3 books I'm rereading. One is Orbiting the Giant Hairball. Have you ever seen this book?
I have not, no.
Okay, it's a quick read. One of my mentors here at Mayo, I won't give his name, recommended me read it. Orbiting the Giant Hairball is an interesting read when you're more of an entrepreneur trying to live within an ecosystem like Mayo Clinic and push the boundaries and not push it so far that you break the elasticity, but also push it to make it better. So Orbiting the Giant Hairball is an interesting read. The other one is The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. With his recent passing, I think it reinvigorated me to go back and read the wisdom of that. I think it's timeless. And I remember so many nuggets out of there, and I again had a mentor that influenced me greatly to think about how timeless that hard drive industry and lessons learned there, and how healthcare is really just playing out the same playbook today. So I think there's really great wisdom in that for healthcare. It's probably been overlooked in the last 5 years as other books have come online, but I'm rereading it, and it's really interesting. And then the third book is again, not real recent, but How Google Works. Another mentor of mine highlighted the importance of that in the context of what we do. And so really those 3 books, rereading, are a fascinating Venn diagram of what we are. If you wonder what we do, how we do it, those 3 books are probably the best example I can give of who we are and how we try to emulate.
Yeah, Orbiting the Giant Hairball is a new one for me. I feel like I have to read that.
It's a short read. You could read it tonight if you want.
Yeah, I'll have to look into it. What has been one key local resource that's been helpful with ReGen?
Yeah, no, Ready was key. I mean, early on it was, some crazy ideas that we had were kicking around, and it was really because of Ready that gave us a shot, right? Took a bet on us, and we're happy to have paid back all the loans we've taken out, and we wouldn't have been able to do that without the investment and the commitment Gary Smith and colleagues early on. We were the first tenant in the BioBusiness building on the 3rd floor. There was nothing there. It was completely open. And we built out the one little corner of the 3rd floor early on. So that dates us all of what we've been doing. And I just look back at those days and so grateful for the mentorship and the partnership that people placed in us. And you never know how these things play out, but if it weren't for bold mentors and bold coaches taking a chance on young ideas, nothing would happen. So I'm forever indebted for that resource and the Rochester community in those 2010, which was a long time ago.
10 years goes fast and slow, right?
No doubt.
That was my last question for you. I'll ask you for any final thoughts and where people can find out more about what you're doing and more info about ReGen.
Yeah, no, come find me on LinkedIn. I'm a big fan on LinkedIn, and it's a great place for us to converge. You'll see a lot of our postings out there. So Tim-Nelson-Cause to Cure is my way to find me on LinkedIn, and then check out our podcast at Cause to Cure, and I'd love to connect more with motivated partners and interested people, and sometimes the crazy ideas that people think, well, I could help you with this, or have you ever thought about that? I really enjoy those kinds of conversations, so I'd encourage anybody to reach out to me and explore a bit more of what we can do together.
Well, thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Dr. Nelson for joining us on the show today, and be sure to listen into his podcast, Cause to Cure. You can find links to that in the show notes. Just a reminder that you can find our podcast and more stories about entrepreneurship and innovation on our website at rochesterrising.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We're always looking for great stories of Rochester-based innovators and entrepreneurship. So if you know of an entrepreneur with a great story to share, send us an email at rochesterrising@gmail.com and let us know. That's a wrap for the podcast today. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so that you never miss a story of entrepreneurship and innovation coming out of Rochester, Minnesota. We'll be here next week with a brand new episode.